Let's go for a mega drive down the road to Genesis. It's another Segaiden Special to chase away those summertime blues. Here we are on the cusp of the launch of Sega's biggest console ever. Although Genesis didn't do so well as Mega Drive in Japan, it killed it as Mega Drive in Europe, and it did even better here in the US. Things are about to change for Sega in a big way. With the arrival of Genesis, I would argue that Sega's home gaming business will finally take their arcade efforts as the format that truly defines the company. And good thing too, because arcades would more or less evaporate as a primary form of entertainment around the world by the time the company stopped supporting Genesis. Without this console to establish the Sega name as a brand to inspire the loyalty of ferocious keyboard warriors everywhere, would the company even have survived until the modern era? Well, maybe. It's not like Genesis's successors did the company many favors, and they all ultimately collapsed in failure. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. These are the salad days we're heading into, a half-decade of dominance for Sega, both at home and in arcades. The beating heart of the company's enduring legacy. With Genesis, Sega perfectly balanced its central focuses: consumer entertainment and coin-op amusement. Segaiden is about the consumer side of things, by which I mean consoles, but even more so than with SG-1000 and Master System, the Genesis story isn't complete without delving into Sega's arcade heritage. And I do mean heritage. Of all the major console manufacturers throughout history, outside of Atari, Sega was the purest video game company, having gotten its start peddling coin-powered amusement machines. It's even right there in the name. Sega is an abbreviation of the company's original moniker, Service Games. And where Atari got its start specifically for the sake of making video games at the dawn of the 1970s, Sega began peddling arcade machines in the 1950s, or even the 40s, depending on how you prefer to trace the company's history and origins. The point is that Sega was a truly multicultural operation based around arcades and amusement vending from day one. Although the company took root in Japan in the 1950s and 60s, one of its founders was an American named David Rosen. And by the end of the 60s, the entire operation belonged to an American media conglomerate, Gulf and Western. Sega established itself in post-war Japan, largely providing entertainment to American servicemen stationed there during the occupation. But as international relations normalized and Japan underwent its successful reconstruction, the nature of Sega's business expanded into things like pinball tables and pachinko boards, not just distributing them, but creating their own new ones as well. These pinball tables evolved into electromechanical machines, which ultimately brought Sega into the world of video games. And while the company naturally released its share of derivative games, can you guess what Pongtron and Pongtron 2 were about? It also made a real effort to create new and novel experiences right from the start. Like 1976's Heavyweight Champ, a primitive boxing game controlled by boxing glove controllers. That same year also saw Motocross, a motorcycle racing game that presented players with a behind-the-bike perspective and used a raster warping effect to drop them into an immersive 3D viewpoint. Even before that, you had Duck Hunt, an electromechanical light gun machine that, debuting in 1969, predates any Nintendo release sharing that name by several years. As a veteran, location-based amusement vendor, Sega understood that success in that space hinged upon a combination of appealing themes, creative presentation, and technical innovation. And so, Sega innovated. They iterated on Motocross, for example, by acquiring the rights to the popular Paramount sitcom Happy Days from their shared corporate parent, Gulf and Western, in order to create a motocross variant called Fonz. Not only was this the first arcade game based on a film or TV property, or so I am led to believe, it also cleverly used a tape deck for audio. Fonz feels to me like a turning point for Sega's business. For the first time, the company brought together a popular character, Fonzie, an appealing genre and game design, a behind-the-vehicle racing game, and technical innovation with raster effects and scaling sprites. This genre naturally lent itself to technical innovation. Fonz laid the groundwork for Sega's future success, which manifested in games like Monaco GP, Turbo, Outrun, Turbo Outrun, Virtua Racing, and Daytona USA. Sometimes the company even made hits that weren't racers. though it should be noted that Sega's tendency to return to the racing well created a positive feedback loop. The great Sega arcade racers caught the attention of racing enthusiasts, most notably Yu Suzuki. Those fanatics applied their unique skill and personal obsessions in equal measure to create even better racing games that drove the company's overall tech and design standards to an even higher level. But even when tiny cars going fast weren't involved, Sega constantly pushed for technical innovation. As part of that initiative, the company acquired US-based electronics firm Gremlin, not only to assist with US distribution, but also to collaborate on tech platforms. Gremlin had devised the VIC Dual hardware system, which ran on a Zilog Z80 chip and became the basis of many of Sega's releases in the late 70s and early 80s. The VIC Dual also powered Denki Onkyo's arcade port of Heiankyo Alien, so hey, take a shot. Segaiden viewers will recognize quite a few games from the VIC Dual platform and its offshoots, including Borderline, Insub, Yamato, Head-On, Sinbad Mystery, and Bank Panic. The VIC system gave Sega a stable, accessible, inexpensive format in which to tinker with different approaches to industry standards like shooters and maze chases. These games didn't need to revolutionize the medium, just to provide Sega with a reliable source of income. The VIC Dual platform feels like Sega's 9-to-5 job, a steady source of income which gave them the freedom to pursue passion projects on the side. These passion projects, perhaps unsurprisingly, followed in the footsteps, or rather trademarks, of Fonz, technically innovative and frequently themed around racing. I've talked pretty extensively at this point about Sega's VCO object tech, which iterated on the scaling sprite elements of Fonz by dedicating actual hardwired tech in order to create an enhanced version of that effect. The VCO object system also ran on a Z80 chip clocked slightly faster than the VIC Duals, but that wasn't the source of the VCO object's power. No, its real strength came from a set of oscillators that, according to System16.com, intercepted graphical data on its way to the screen in order to affect the way it rendered that information on screen. Basically, the oscillators could accelerate or slow down the rate at which sprite elements output from the graphics chip, which would change the size at which those sprites appeared on the screen. By slowing the output rate, the hardware could make sprites appear larger by, more or less, stretching the image during the rendering process, and vice versa by oscillating faster. This allowed the hardware to create shockingly convincing scaling effects, which Sega naturally applied to a racing game, Turbo, in addition to a pair of shooters. Yes, just 3 games. Yet, for a format that powered so few arcade titles, the VCO object concept had a remarkable impact on Sega's future work. Its sprite scaling mechanism would inspire a decade of arcade hardware designed to create maximum visual impact with fake 3D effects, beginning a couple of years later with Hang-On and Space Harrier. These so-called superscaler boards put Sega at the forefront of the arcade business in a way that even hits like Turbo and Zaxxon hadn't achieved. And the company continued iterating on the Hang-On hardware format by throwing additional processors and add-ons at the problem, resulting in a steady succession of bleeding-edge games like Afterburner, Power Drift, and Galaxy Force that left the competition scrambling to catch up. Sega would eventually shift its focus to polygon-based 3D graphics, but that wouldn't happen until 1992's Virtual Racer arrived on the cutting-edge Model 1 board. In 1989, Superscaler still reigned supreme. And given that the Y board contained 3 separate Motorola 68000 processors running in tandem, that level of tech remained years beyond the reach of affordable consumer-level hardware. For reference, the Y board ran on 3 68000 processors clocked at 16 MHz. The top-of-the-line Apple Macintosh computer in 1989 was the Mac IIX, which ran on a single 16 MHz 68030. As a proper 32-bit chip, the 68030 offered somewhere around 2 to 3 times the effective processing power of a 68000. So, for argument's sake, power roughly comparable to the Y board's triple 68000s. The Mac IIX retailed for around $7,700 at the time. Even accounting for the Apple tax, which existed even in the 80s, there's still no way Sega could have made a Y board equivalent for home use that they could have priced within the range of normal human budgets. Or even within the budget of that rich kid in your class whose parents didn't flinch at dropping $200 on a new Neo Geo cart every couple of months. But that's okay, because the VIC Dual tech evolved in parallel to the children of the VCO object system. This lineage of machines may not have been capable of the same jaw-dropping 3D effects as superscaler tech, but it impressed in its own more traditional 2D way. The VIC Dual eventually begat the System 1 and System 2 boards, which also utilized the trusty Z80 chip but applied greater processing power and more RAM to the task of running video games. The System 1 and 2 powered many of Sega's diligent workhorse arcade titles that would eventually find immortality in console form, including Choplifter, Flicky, Sega Ninja, Teddy Boy, and of course, Wonder Boy. By that point, Sega had already planted the seeds for what would become the System 16 board. The System 16 may not have been as impressive in terms of presentation as the Superscaler family, but a System 16 machine cost a whole lot less for an arcade operator to install, and was therefore a lot more likely to make back its money without charging customers $1 per play. The System 16 became Sega's workhorse platform, where you went for solid game experiences that didn't necessarily push the boundaries of technology and visuals, but could still deliver a damn good time, and a damn good looking one. The System 16, and its variants, the System 24 and System 18, served up something like 6 dozen different games over the course of their lifetime. These may not have been front-of-the-arcade attention grabbers the way, say, Afterburner was, but these were still games that I certainly remember seeing in prominent spots at Putt-Putt or Time Out. Golden Axe, Altered Beast, Gain Ground, Shinobi, where the Scalar line stood out for its marquee releases and positioned Sega as master of the medium. System 16 games filled out the ranks and reinforced the notion that the Sega logo meant every bit as much as that ostentatious Nintendo seal of quality. And more importantly, Sega's non-scalar games paved the way for Sega's consoles in a way that the company's cutting-edge titles couldn't. Although Sega could never have sold a Y-board level console at retail at a reasonable price, their more modest platforms turned out to be more or less purpose-built for home consumers. Since the VIC Dual and System 1 ran on Z80 chips, Sega had little trouble converting them into console form. The Z80 and its variants powered half the consumer devices on the market in the 80s, and that included the curiously pervasive spec that Sega built their debut console, the SG-1000, around. The SG-1000 shared nearly identical specs with the VIC Dual, but also with the ColecoVision console and the MSX home computer, among others. This made for a fairly powerful yet accessible platform at the time of the SG-1000's debut, and it opened the door for the clone program that gave us the Othello Multivision and Pioneer SG G5. But it did result in a system that aged fairly quickly in the face of the more capable devices like Famicom and NES. This led us to Master System, which worked in principle a lot like the System 1 platform. It ran on the same core processor as the SG-1000, a Z80 like the VIC Dual, but beefed up its capabilities with an enhanced graphics coprocessor. The Master System didn't have quite the same capabilities as a System 1 machine, just as the SG-1000 had slightly lower resolution and a smaller color palette than the VIC Dual, but it came pretty close. In fact, it operated with sufficient juice to fake some of the lower-end Superscaler games pretty convincingly, which allowed Sega to launch the Master System with a damn good port of Hang-On in tow. Still, the Master System arrived at the tail end of the System 1's lifespan in arcades. Impressive as that console was, which was quite impressive, it couldn't keep pace with Sega's cutting-edge arcade boards, as we've seen in recent Segaiden episodes. In other words, to this point, Sega's home business has constantly been playing catch-up with the company's amusement tech. They made incredible arcade games, then brought those games home, usually with the highest quality possible. But even Sega's own home teams couldn't always create convincing renditions of their arcade machines. I keep bagging on Altered Beast for Master System, but it's not like this is a new problem. Just go back and look at Enduro Racer for God's sake. And if we're being honest, this was kind of by design. Sega gave its amusement division teams considerable budgets to create new tech, fine-tune designs, and even do research, like Yu Suzuki's famous European road trip to prep for Outrun. Its home teams were all about economy, small teams cranking out games in a matter of months or even weeks. Consoles didn't get to take the lead for Sega, rarities like Phantasy Star notwithstanding. But what if Sega made a console as powerful as one of their arcade boards? What if their home teams had the time and resources to make games that felt as consistently cutting edge on consoles as their best arcade machines did? In short, what if Sega made a console based around its current, active arcade platform, and then threw developer talent and decent budgets behind it? It's a question that you couldn't help but ask when you saw the likes of Altered Beast or Thunderblade stumbling drunkenly towards something approximating playability on Master System, knowing that they, and you, deserved better. And this question leads us to Sega Genesis, which we'll see in action next week.